Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. You know, something completely unexpected just landed. A 3-day ceasefire in Ukraine, announced by President Putin. It's definitely caught the international community off guard.
Absolutely. Yeah, quite the surprise. The window for this cessation of hostilities is set from midnight between May 7th and 8th.
Okay.
And it's scheduled to end at midnight between May 10th and 11th. What's really fascinating, though, is the sheer variety of interpretations we're seeing from different Western news outlets about this move.
That's exactly what we're diving into today. I mean, what are the key angles being reported, and what's the broader context we need to understand here? Let's start with what the New York Times is making of this.
Okay, so the New York Times seems to be framing this, partly anyway, as a response to the U.S. president's administration's increasing desire to see an end to the conflict.
Impatience, ma'am.
Impatience, yes. But what's also interesting is their perspective that this is a strategic maneuver by President Putin. They believe he's aiming to maintain a strong position for any potential future agreement, The NYT even suggested, and this is quite telling, that Trump needs something bigger, sort of implying Putin is trying to find a way to accommodate the U.S. president's objectives while still ensuring outcomes that benefit Russia.
So the idea is this might be a kind of tactical concession to maybe gain a more significant advantage later on. Now, what's Bloomberg's take on all of this?
Well, Bloomberg is focusing more on the fact that President Putin has actually rejected a longer 30-day ceasefire.
Oh, interesting.
Which was apparently proposed by the U.S. president. They also highlight Secretary of State Rubio's recent statement where he emphasized that the upcoming week is going to be critically important for a potential settlement in Ukraine.
So that really underscores that the length of any ceasefire remains a key point of disagreement.
Exactly. There's still a significant gap, it seems, in what each side envisions for a pause in the fighting.
Makes sense. What about The Guardian? What's their perspective on this announcement?
The Guardian shifts the focus a bit towards the Kremlin's expectation of reciprocal actions from Ukraine. They're emphasizing the warning that the Kremlin issued, stating that if Ukraine violates this 3-day ceasefire, Russia will respond in an adequate and effective manner. So this definitely puts pressure back onto Ukraine to adhere to it as well.
So it's not just a unilateral move without, strings attached, at least not from Russia's perspective.
Yeah.
It's turning to Newsweek. It seems they've picked up on a rather strong reaction directly from Ukraine itself.
Yes, they have. Newsweek is reporting on a statement from Ukraine's foreign minister, Andriy Sybiha, who questioned the timing of this announcement.
How so?
Well, he basically asked why the ceasefire would only begin on May 8th if it's genuinely possible sooner,
Right, good point.
And he also stated that Ukraine is ready for a long-term, durable, and complete ceasefire of at least 30 days. So that clearly indicates their skepticism about the limited nature of this Russian initiative.
Yeah, it really highlights the deep mistrust, doesn't it? And the differing objectives at play here. Now, Le Journal du Dimanche raises a very fundamental question. Will this actually, materialize into a genuine truce?
That's the absolute central point they're addressing. They note Moscow has expressed concerns about potential violations of the ceasefire by Ukraine. Standard stuff? Maybe. But they also point out the Kremlin stated humanitarian considerations as the reason behind this move. And interestingly, they also mention President Putin's own declarations expressing Umir readiness for peaceful negotiations. And Dolaja, Yubamo, Dudamir, pour Memorgie, Balusho, and constructive interaction with international partners. So you've got this mix of stated humanitarian goals alongside, underlying suspicions.
It's definitely a bit of a mixed bag of signals coming from Moscow. Now, the Berliner Zeitung introduces another interesting angle, doesn't it? By connecting the timing of this ceasefire announcement to what seems to be a growing openness from President Zelensky towards the U.S. president's peace efforts.
Exactly. They highlight the U.S. president's Sunday statement, suggesting that President Zelensky might actually be prepared to concede Crimea to Russia as part of a broader peace agreement.
Wow, that would be a major shift.
Huge shift. Huh. And it's important to remember that Ukraine has consistently rejected this idea in the past. So the Berliner Zeitung is drawing attention to the potential influence the U.S. president's diplomatic efforts might be having on the current situation.
Which adds yet another layer of complexity for us to unravel.
Yeah.
But Der Spiegel urges us to be cautious in how we interpret all this. They suggest there might be more to the timing than meets the eye.
Yeah, Der Spiegel is advising caution, definitely. They point out that the timing of this ceasefire, happening around the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, likely indicates a focus on Russian symbolism.
Symbolism.
Rather than, a genuine and substantive push for actual peace negotiations. Their perspective is basically, let's be wary of overinterpreting this as a true commitment to lasting peace.
So perhaps more about historical messaging than immediate diplomatic intent. Okay. Now, shifting our focus a bit to developments on the ground, there have been reports concerning the Kursk region.
That's right. According to these reports, President Putin has announced what he's calling the complete failure of the Ukrainian offensive in the Kursk region.
Complete failure.
And the liberation of the last village there, Gornal. Apparently, General Gerasimov reported directly to President Putin, confirming that Ukrainian forces have been expelled from the area.
And the reports indicate that President Putin stated that this development now creates conditions for further Russian advances. Is that the takeaway?
That's the implication being reported, yes. It's worth remembering, though, that Ukrainian forces had managed to hold some territory in this border region since that unexpected incursion back in August of last year.
Right, that incursion did take many by surprise at the time.
It really did. And the reports detail the involvement of North Korean forces in pushing the Ukrainian troops back.
North Korean forces.
Yes. General Gerasimov specifically praised their high professionalism, their resilience, courage, and heroism. Initial estimates suggested around 14,000 North Korean soldiers were involved.
14,000.
It's the number floating around. And while they reportedly suffered significant early losses, which was attributed to a lack of experience with armored vehicles and drone warfare, they apparently adapted quite quickly to the battlefield conditions.
So a notable development in that area then with international implications regarding the forces involved. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of the U.S. president's recent meeting with President Zelensky, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Their meeting in Rome during the Pope's funeral has been described as very productive. And this context is really important because the U.S. president has reportedly been exerting pressure on President Zelensky to consider ceding Ukrainian territory as a way to sort of accelerate an end to the conflict.
Which leads us, naturally, to consider the broader strategic picture. What's the general analysis of Russia's overarching goals in this whole situation?
Well, the analysis being presented suggests that Russia's announced ceasefire serves a dual purpose. It has both diplomatic and strategic objectives. The thinking is that it further disadvantages Ukraine, which, let's face it, has largely transitioned to a defensive posture across the entire front line now.
Making it much more challenging for Ukraine to regain any of the territory it has lost.
Precisely. And the reported complete liberation of the Kursk region is significant because it's believed to have freed up a substantial number of Russian troops. Estimates suggest this could be as many as 250,000 soldiers.
Wow, 250,000. That's a considerable number of troops potentially being redeployed somewhere else.
It is. And even accounting for the necessary time for replenishment and rest, this represents a significant reserve that could be used for a potential summer offensive. And Western media outlets have also noted an intensification of fighting south of Konstantinovka. Reports indicate Ukraine is losing more territory there than it's regaining, and that these troop movements from Kursk are reinforcing Russian pressure in that area specifically.
So given these troop movements, where might Russia potentially focus its efforts for this potential summer offensive? What are analysts saying?
Military analysts suggest that the Sumy region is a likely primary target. A successful operation there could potentially lead to the complete control of Donbass.
Which would be huge.
And it would pose a serious threat to major Ukrainian cities like Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk. There's even speculation that Sumy could be established as a kind of demilitarized buffer zone.
A buffer zone.
But another possibility is an offensive further south, down in the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. The aim there could be to secure more territory, maybe leading to a frozen conflict along the current front lines. And perhaps even extending Russian control to the northern Black Sea coast, including strategically important cities like Mykolaiv and Odessa.
These potential scenarios represent some really significant, potentially game-changing shifts in the conflict. What's the overall sentiment like among Ukrainian soldiers, given all these pressures? Do we know?
Well, reports indicate a prevailing sentiment among Ukrainian soldiers, which includes a desire for a ceasefire, yes, but with the primary focus being on saving lives rather than holding on to territory at all costs.
Saving lives over land.
That seems to be the feeling. One reconnaissance soldier with the call sign has reportedly voiced this perspective quite clearly. There are also reports suggesting a perhaps widespread acceptance among Ukrainians for potential territorial concessions. This is attributed to the ongoing Asator.
It's a term used here, seems to describe relentless pressure and attrition, basically, and of course the increasing number of casualties.
So a potential shift in priorities on the Ukrainian side, really driven by the harsh realities of the conflict. Some Ukrainian officials, like Kyiv Mayor Klitschko, have reportedly expressed openness to the possibility of territorial losses as a way to end the conflict.
Really? Klitschko?
That's what's being reported. And this is in contrast to the more hardline stance of what is being referred to as the Kyiv junta, which continues to insist on the restoration of Ukraine's 1991 borders. So it suggests a divergence in opinion within Ukrainian leadership.
Yeah, that definitely highlights the incredibly difficult choices and internal pressures Ukraine is facing right now. And this all brings us back, doesn't it, to the U.S. president's proposed peace plan. What are the key elements that are generally understood to be part of that plan?
Well, the full details haven't been officially released, as you know, but the generally understood conditions seem to include an immediate ceasefire, direct negotiations between Moscow and Kyiv, a commitment that Ukraine will not join NATO.
Right, no NATO.
A resources and infrastructure agreement with the U.S., official U.S. recognition of Russian sovereignty over Crimea.
Official recognition.
Yes. And unofficially, it seems, over other currently occupied territories as well. Plus, the lifting of sanctions on Russia, contingent on no resumption of hostilities.
And the assessment of those terms.
The prevailing assessment is that these terms are, well, significantly unfavorable for Ukraine, to put it mildly.
It certainly sounds like a very, very difficult proposition for Ukraine. However, the analysis we're looking at suggests that continuing the conflict under the current circumstances might actually be even more detrimental for them.
That's really the crux of the argument being presented. The strategic impact of the reported loss of experienced fighters in the Kursk region, that's huge. And it's coupled with the difficult decisions Ukraine faces regarding the allocation of its dwindling reserves. These are significant concerns.
Yeah.
The analysis points to a, frankly, catastrophic decline in the number of experienced Ukrainian officers and soldiers. And furthermore, the withdrawal of U.S. military support, if that were to happen. Well, it's expected to have a swift and dramatic impact on the battlefield.
How so immediately?
Immediately, you'd likely see the cessation of intelligence sharing and targeting assistance. Then, the eventual halting of ammunition, weapon systems, spare parts deliveries that would have a delayed but equally devastating effect. And you can't underestimate the psychological boost this would provide to Russia for its summer campaign.
And the idea that European allies could simply step in and, fully compensate for that loss of U.S. support seems, well, unrealistic.
The limitations of European and other allies in fully replacing U.S. support are definitely emphasized. And on top of that, the reported absence of significant, well-prepared fortifications between the Donbas-Kursk borders and the Dnieper River represents a major vulnerability for Ukraine.
A huge vulnerability.
This lack of defenses would make organized resistance extremely difficult, especially given Russia's air superiority and its increasing use of things like guided bombs and loitering munitions.
It paints a very, very concerning picture for Ukraine's ability to defend its territory going forward.
The analysis goes so far as to suggest a high probability that a major Russian summer offensive could, potentially, mark the end of Ukraine's post-Soviet history as an independent nation.
Wow, the end.
The potential loss of significant territory on the right bank of the Dnieper River could lead to the collapse of its political and administrative systems. There is even the grim prospect of neighboring countries potentially seizing Ukrainian land in such a scenario.
A complete breakdown.
And Kyiv's current reliance on what are described as uncertain EU promises, the delayed formation of a coalition of the willing, coupled with a reported increasing reluctance in Europe to support Ukraine without U.S. backing, especially with diminishing prospects of success, it all just underscores the precariousness of this situation.
So a deeply complex and frankly quite concerning situation. We have this 3-day ceasefire sparking varied interpretations and at the same time the very real threat of a major Russian summer offensive looming large. The U.S. president's involvement in his proposed peace plan could indeed be a pivotal turning point.
It truly is a multifaceted situation with potentially profound and far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. A lot to watch in the coming weeks and months.
Absolutely. Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.